The silence of America's unions. Blocking injured workers instead of helping them for years, I have fought tirelessly to bring attention to the injustices faced by injured workers, particularly farm workers in America. I have reached out to unions, progressive organizations, and advocacy groups, only to be met with silence, avoidance, and in some cases, outright blocking. The most painful of these betrayals comes from the United Farm Workers, an organization that frequently invokes the legacy of Cesar Chavez, yet refuses to stand up for those who continue to suffer under exploitative labor conditions today. The hypocrisy of union leadership despite the public-facing image of unions as protectors of labor rights. My experience has revealed a troubling pattern. Many of these organizations function more as political fronts led by small business interests than as genuine defenders of workers. Instead of using their platforms to amplify the voices of those being harmed, they engage in selective advocacy, prioritizing issues that align with political convenience over the urgent needs of laborers. The United Farm Workers have actively blocked me from engaging with them on social media, effectively shutting down any conversation about the suffering of injured farm workers in Washington state. This is not an isolated incident. Many other liberal organizations, including the Latino Civic Alliance and OneAmerica, have similarly ignored, deflected, or downplayed the crisis. These groups, which claim to champion the rights of immigrants and low-wage workers, refuse to acknowledge the war being waged against those very same people by state agencies and employers. Farm workers in crisis. A manufactured silence. The Washington state labor and industry system has systematically failed injured workers, particularly farm workers, who are often Latino immigrants. Hundreds have come forward with testimonies of being denied rightful compensation, forced into exploitative conditions, and, in some cases, worked to death. Yet, instead of rallying to their defense, unions and advocacy groups have chosen to ignore or suppress these voices. When I contacted the Latino Civic Alliance, led by Gabriel Nunez, I expected an ally in the fight for justice. Instead, I was met with indifference. Even after providing clear evidence of systemic failures harming over 400 injured farm workers, the organization refused to take meaningful action. Their refusal to demand minimum federal oversight, as advocated by Senator Bernie Sanders, Senator Patty Murray, and former Secretary of Labor Tom Perez, demonstrates their unwillingness to challenge the status quo. The failure of the progressive left. Time and again, I have seen liberal organizations and politicians abandon injured workers in favor of issues that align with their broader political ambitions. While they speak passionately about Medicare for all, immigration reform, and labor protections, they actively sideline discussions about minimum federal standards for workers' compensation. The silence from figures like Mary Foss, Mike Sells, and other so-called labor advocates exposes the harsh reality. These people do not want injured workers' issues on the political table. Even when confronted with the undeniable truth, such as the NPR report revealing that Washington state is one of 33 states failing injured workers, they remain silent. The hard truth is that unions and advocacy groups are complicit in the erosion of the workers' grand bargain, choosing to align with business interests rather than stand up for those who have been injured, exploited, and discarded by the system. The Laken Riley Act and the American Families United Act. More silence. The hypocrisy of these so-called labor advocates extends beyond workers' compensation. Their silence on the Laken Riley Act, which highlights the failings of immigration enforcement in the name of public safety, and the American Families United Act, which would provide long overdue protections for mixed-status immigrant families, further demonstrates their selective advocacy. These acts directly impact the very communities that unions and liberal organizations claim to support, yet they remain silent, exposing their unwillingness to confront issues that challenge their political alliances. National COSH. In its Betrayal each year, National COSH releases the Dirty Dozen list, highlighting the worst employers endangering workers. Yet, despite this annual effort, they fail to educate the public about the urgent need for basic federal human rights protections and a National Workers' Compensation Commission. Their failure to push for minimum federal standards effectively leaves workers vulnerable, reinforcing the very conditions they claim to oppose. The Latino left is killing its own people with silence. The Latino Civic Alliance, along with other Latino-led organizations, has failed its own community by choosing business interests over the lives of injured and exploited Latino workers. Instead of advocating for meaningful labor protections, they serve as gatekeepers, ensuring that the voices of farm workers and injured laborers never reach the national conversation. These organizations, run by business Mexicans, are not fighting for the people, they are profiting from their silence. What needs to change? End the political cover UPS. Organizations like UFW, LCA, OneAmerica, and National COSH must be held accountable for ignoring injured workers. They cannot continue to parade under the banner of labor advocacy while refusing to confront the very real struggles of those they claim to represent. Demand federal oversight. Injured workers across the country need minimum federal standards to prevent states from gutting their workers' compensation systems and cost-shifting to federal programs. Without federal intervention, this crisis will only worsen. Expose the fake labor movement. Too many so-called labor leaders are nothing more than business elites in disguise. These organizations must be called out for their inaction and their complicity in the suffering of injured workers. Amplify the voices of injured workers. Instead of allowing unions and advocacy groups to dictate the narrative, injured workers must take control of their own stories. Through independent platforms, direct action, and grassroots organizing, we must force these issues into the public discourse. Conclusion: the betrayal of injured workers by unions and liberal advocacy groups is one of the greatest political scandals of our time. While these organizations claim to fight for workers, their actions, or lack thereof, tell a different story. They have chosen to side with power rather than the people they claim to represent. This is not just negligence. It is an active betrayal of the labor movement's core values. I will not be silent. I will continue to fight for minimum federal oversight and the rights of injured workers, regardless of how many doors are slammed in my face. To those who have blocked me, ignored me, or dismissed this issue, history will remember where you stood when workers were dying. This fight is not over. It is only just beginning,